you can do so now. Yeah, welcome everyone to the open semifinals. Congratulations for both teams making it thus far. And I guess since everyone's ready, you can just start the debate right around. Calling the first affirmative to start the debate. Here.
Okay, before starting my speech, I just want to treat this semifinal as my grand final because this is the longest I've gone through in all classics that I've been joining. Thank you, my teammates, and it's also such a pleasure for me to debate against ATMA A. Best of luck for all of us. I'm gonna start my speech in three. Oh, by the way, I'm terribly sorry if I'm coughing mid rounds. I'm gonna start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Economic liberalism is good only when you have a mature economy. This might be good for the West, like the US or the European Union, but this might not be the case for developing countries. Few points of setups here. First, I think the counterfactual and affirmative is that we don't say that we are not going to be totally liberal, but what happens in F is that the balance of government's intervention. For example, like we sure do have tariffs, but probably it's 10% of it. Negative cannot say that we're half stance because it is stated in a motion insofar that the existence of liberalism is not the dominant doctrine, it's already a counterfactual and affirmative. But the second, we also understand that IMF wants a democratic reform. We also pander to that. Politically, probably democratic reform would still exist under our side of the house, but in terms of economy, we're still going to be very much socialist. For example, like in EU and other examples. And the third point of setup is that we're going to set the vulnerable actor. The path to victory in this debate is which teams who can actually help the vulnerable actor, which is the developing countries or countries who are still in need of government intervention, for example, like the South Pacific Islands or Indonesia and other types of developing countries. In line of that, I have one substantive that I'm going to bring in this debate. I'm going to talk about how WTO are most likely going to be very much inaccessible inside negative. There are 3 broad points here. First, I'm going to talk about how it's going to be very much bad in terms of the fiscal policy. But second, I'm going to talk about how most likely these Bretton Woods institutions are highly controlled by the West. And third, I'm going to talk about the implication. First, then, the context is that if you want to be part of the WTO with this economic liberalism doctrine, most likely you have to minimize government's intervention. And the implication of that is that you're going to cut fiscal policy through government spending because most likely you're going to reallocate your money to opt into like trade. You're going to like basically prevent from having too much government intervention in terms of that fiscal policy to probably be allocated to the monetary policy to strengthen the exchange or currency rate. What is going to happen in negative is that there will be less subsidies because fiscal policy APBN is so much important to give subsidies not only to individuals but also to corporations who are basically in the rate of SOEs and SMEs. And this means that public institutions are most likely going to be privatized anyway inside negative. The harm is that in 2 scenarios. Within that fiscal policy is still important to boost SMEs under these 2 scenarios. First, within that fiscal policy is the prerequisite for you to do an economic liberalization, because understand that the premise of economic liberalization is that you want to focus on your trade. You want to focus in international trade and market, right? But I think like when your country are not really necessarily sustainable and that good to produce like goods and services, most likely you're not going to be able to opt into like the international market anyway. Therefore, this fiscal policy is so much important for that government are able to give SMEs these budgets and also like these subsidies for SMEs who are basically still thriving or about to thrive, especially noticing that there has been a lot of economic collapses post-COVID. If only some industries or businesses they're able to tap into the international trade, most likely what will happen in next is that there will be a higher economic gap internally in a certain country, in the developing country. But the second scenario is that even if sure your local businesses are able to produce and are able to tap into the international market. We think that most of the time the investment are supported by FDI. I'm gonna name drop like Freeport or MRT. Like it's basically supported by China, and FDI and Freeport is supported by US. Where in Freeport, 55% of the profit goes to United States. Indonesia only get like 45% of it, whereas the natural resources belongs to Indonesia. This becomes problematic. Or like in other types of FDI, for example, like Apple tapping into Indonesia. Sure, they would like have their market here, but it's less likely for them to opt for like Indonesian or local workers. They would most likely hire expats because they have less incentive to train people from ground zero, because all the money has been gone through like taxes the moment they want to open like a multinational company here. What I want to say is that even if in the best case scenario of negative for these businesses are able to strive in international market, the net benefit or of profit are not going to go to these countries anyway. It's not going to be beneficial to the country. But the second is that within when economic liberalism happens, you give all these countries governments control to the WTO and also the Bretton Woods institutions, where not all countries are going to are ready to be liberalized. Understand that in certain country, in some specific country, let's just say Indonesia, regulation of market is still necessary, so that the development of industry is controllable. For example, like when Gojek first exists, only when government are able to intervene and give an anti-monopolistic and also like a good competition policy, there are more proliferation of businesses. For example, like Maxim, you have a local product like that, or like the other green, I forgot the name. But like there are more proliferation of businesses where the regulation of the market are able, or like the regulation of the market can also be in terms of like wages support towards people, and how like people are able to get wages, have like a good work jobs to ensure that people have a demand towards a certain market. And this is something very much important. The weighing is simple here. I think even irrespective of like the good faith that negative side have, I think it's very, very, very more important for us to prioritize on the output instead of like the incentive, because the output is something that is very much crucial for the economy of these developing countries, as they're very much prevalent and also very much fragile to economic disruption. But the second thing I want to posit is that IMF, WTO, and other Bretton Woods institutions are most likely pandering towards the West. Why? Because Western are their biggest lenders. That is why if you take a look at WTO's policy, it's most likely discriminative towards people who do not necessarily want to be does not necessarily want to affirm the Western doctrines. For example, like Indonesia. Indonesia is currently being sanctioned by the WTO because we made a new policy of downstreaming, where you can no longer like sell raw nickels towards Western countries or all countries, but then it's being condemned by the WTO. Why do they condemn this? Because now you know that when raw nickel is no longer exported by Indonesia, the prices of nickel are going to be very much expensive, and this what crushes Western or like European Union who wants to build EV, because they do not have a nickel production in comparative to China. This is something that is going to be very, very bad under side negative. Other than there is a double punishment, meaning that the Bretton Woods institutions are very much unfair. This is also practically problematic because small countries like Indonesia are screwed. Small and developing countries becomes exploited. The harm is not only towards these small countries, to be honest, but this is also harm towards the Bretton Woods institution if we have to be very much inclusive and tapping all actors here. The harm to the Bretton Woods institution is that not only you lose a potential trader coming from the small countries, because most likely small countries are countries with a lot of resources. For example, like Indonesia, ASEAN as a whole, or like Pacific Islands, we have a lot of resources. You're going to lose us as your potential contributors by all those reasons. Affirm, sorry.
Thank you for that remark. Now can I have first negative?
Hi, just checking if I'm audible and visible.
Yes.
Great. Pronouns, he, him, you can just call me first negative. Similar remarks to Sharon before I start my speech. Just want to say an honor to not only be in the semifinals, but to be debating against a team I cherish so much as OEA. Love you guys, all of you. And yeah, hopefully this is a fun round. So, starting my speech in 3, to what? This is not just a free trade motion. I think the most important idea that we need to clarify in this debate is that this is specifically through the perspective of international financial institutions, meaning their stance and how countries respond to it becomes important to the debate. Two points of setup for negatives case, and then furthermore, later on, I'm going to talk about arguments. First and foremost, when does this doctrine actually manifest? I think it runs when emerging companies, or emerging economies rather, go to the IMF and the World Bank. This looks like Venezuela or Sri Lanka getting loans to boost their country after many crises, after many examples of basically inflation and recession within their economies. And these loans and these policies that the World Bank tries to push on them only works if they commit to free trade policies. What this means is a demand to essentially open up their country to foreign direct investment and allowing Venezuelan oil, for example, to be traded internationally. But the second point of setup is what is the limitation of this doctrine? Because I don't think affirmative gives a half stance, but I think the similar sort of engaging charitable setup needs to also apply for negative side. Just because this doctrine exists does not inherently mean countries stop making protectionist policies, insofar as you still see some amount of regulation on industries. You also see some amount of like tariffs or just like bea cukai might exist to the extent of like you still want to empower your own local industries. You still want to ensure that SMEs don't die out simply because foreign companies come in. So in the sense of economic liberalism becoming the doctrine by these financial institutions, it means that when these countries seek help for WTO to broker trade deals, for IMF to give them micro loans or just empowerment, for World Bank to give developmental assistance, this is when economic liberalism actually takes place. So this does not mean all emerging economies will have to be liberal. It means that when your emerging economy faces a crisis to the extent where you need the help of these financial institutions, this is when they're going to tell you that, okay, we're going to help you within the conditionality of you liberalizing your economy and opening those doors up to other countries. Therefore, two arguments to prove why this actually is inherently beneficial. First and foremost, just a comparative on how the doctrine is implemented and status quo. And second off, talking about like the importance of the doctrine creating worse power imbalances in affirmative. Let's first and foremost talk about the comparative in this debate. I think a quick and important status quo analysis that I need to make is that the WTO actively tries to push free trade in order for global economic development. The example that Sharon uses is that Indonesia is currently sanctioned by the WTO because we wanted to essentially limit the amount of raw nickel that can be exported, because what we wanted to do was ensure that this is something that is processed. Irrespective of protectionist stances from countries, IMF also only gives loans and assistance if a country commits to ensuring that free trade is likely to be accessible. When the World Bank helps a developing country, it's always with the goal of ensuring FDI is possible. What's important to understand here is that when this is a dominant doctrine, they will push for this when giving assistance in the form of loans, and I think the counterfactual is much worse. Because in affirmative's world, free trade is a privilege that will only be accessible by economic powerhouses like the United States, European Union, etc. And this doctrine inherently matters because it pushes the idea of accessibility. What accessibility are we talking about? Access to free trade, technology from other countries that you can implement within your own industries. The reason Indonesia is now able to actually process our local resources, Indonesia has blessed smelters in like regions like Papua and Maluku. The reason why we have all of that is because of free trade. It is because we were able to cooperate with countries like China and India, and therefore gain all of that technology that we're able to use in order to protect our own economy, to ensure that output is not only protected, but we can also ensure that industries like mining and extraction essentially are also able to thrive within our economy. This is inherently exclusive when we posit to you that protectionist policies exist from the get-go, regardless of the debate. But when economic liberalism becomes this doctrine, this is when countries realize that if I want to develop, I will have to open my doors up. This is therefore what helps us down the long run. I think this is also exclusive to the doctrine because aside from getting like technology from other countries, access to infrastructure, and being actually able to engage into the global economy, this is when in affirmatives counterfactual, IMF gives loans to these countries like in these positions without the guarantee that the country is able to manage these funds in a way that actually benefits their economy. So yes, Venezuela and Sri Lanka still gets like a loan, for example. But here's the reality check. Free trade policies inherently ensure an increase in these countries' GDP. Like being able to not necessarily reverse, but at the very least manage the harms of inflation and recession on your economy, increasing the purchasing power of your country. And this is especially important when your country is in such a like deep hole of economic downturn that you absolutely need to ensure that from the perspective of these financial institutions, you ensure that not only does your money, return, but your money is actually being put where it actually matters and ensures that the country can manifest its better economic policies. So the burden on affirmative is not just to prove like the existence of harm, but they need to prove the likelihood of benefit that within their existing counterfactual, without this dominant doctrine, countries that still opt in to help from major financial institutions are also going to be able to use that fund adequately and ensure the inherent benefit towards their economy to prevent further degrees of harm. Because we can easily posit to you 5, 10, 15 years in the future, inflation and recession is going to impact these countries just as much, if not way worse. Secondly, therefore, talking about power imbalances, and this is sort of a nice segue to this, because this is much worse when you don't have assistance. Note that economic liberalism exists as a safety net for emerging companies and for emerging economies and developing countries to prevent them from being sucked into harmful decision making and either A, losing out in competition against other countries, or B, flat out making poor fiscal policies pushing like government funding on the wrong industries and eventually therefore harming them later down the line. So why is it on the financial institutions themselves? Because when they're giving help to developing countries, it's also in the best interest in ensuring A, yeah, IMF gets their money back after giving loans, but B, equalizing the pace of development between those countries and the ones around them. Because especially when you seek assistance, it's always when these countries are in a vulnerable condition. It's always when these countries are like facing such a high degree of inflation. It's always when the purchasing power of these countries are like lowered to that extent that they need help from these other institutions. Otherwise, their economies collapse. This means that the doctrine is important to maintain and preventing further harm towards these countries. Because when these institutions actually give assistance, the goal of the assistance itself is to actually assist and ensure stability happens. So that is also affirmative's burden to prove why these countries, especially when they are the vulnerable actor that we both agree on in this debate, are also going to be able to survive without this sort of policy being pushed on them as an inherent condition. When you have that condition, you have pressure to maintain, you actually have pressure to ensure that these policies are actively helping your people, actively helping your country, and actively ensuring that your economy is stable. And without all of those sort of pushes from the international institutions, then that's going to be much, much worse on affirmative side. Continuously proud to negate.
Thank you. Now can I have second affirmative?
Hello. Yeah, same remarks as Sharon, I suppose. For pronouns, he, him, although I don't think you would need to use my pronouns. Yeah. Okay. Start my speech in 3, 2, and 1. We agree with negative that global economic development is a very noble goal. But the point on the outside of the house is that this process is hijacked by Western states. Because even though the goal of financial assistance is indeed stability for these developing countries, it is only stability to the extent that benefits Western interests. This is why, despite the hundreds of millions of dollars that Apple has invested into Indonesia, actual Indonesians see not even hardly a penny of that being returned to them. And this is what we principally opposed under our side of the house, but also pragmatically speaking, insofar that countries and even developing ones need to be in the WTO and need to be in the IMF to be able to sustain their economy or to be able to conduct trade. What was bad was the fact that they were forced into a certain kind of economic framework that did not fit the specific context of their country, especially those who are post-revolutionary or post-government upturn. And that is why you affirm. I just want to frame perhaps two things. Firstly, is on the idea of being isolationist. I don't think it's necessarily true that countries or developing countries on our side are going to be fully isolationist. And I'll expand on this further in my arguments. But just as a note, we also have nothing against these countries implementing economic liberalism later down the line if it happens to work for them. Like if Singapore wants to be economically liberal and they think they can take that on, fine with them doing that. We're just giving the countries the option to do that under our side of the house. But secondly, under protectionist policies, we're not saying that they don't exist, but our points are saying that protectionist policies are only implemented when they benefit Western interests. I think Negative also concedes to this when they say that the idea of nickel was something that they agreed with, which is something we explained that even when Indonesia tried to benefit from its nickel production to benefit its people, for example, it was still sanctioned by Western powers because the European Union stand to lose a lot by Indonesia ramping up its nickel production and downstreaming that. So our point isn't that protectionist policies don't exist, it's just that when they do exist, it's often to benefit Western powers. So with that, I just want to talk very quickly about what the context of most developing countries under our side are. And this is also sort of to answer the biggest question under their side of the house, which is that you require a good allocation of funding and a return of investment, basically, for these institutions to be able to place sort of like trust within your country and to sustain you in the long run. I want to note that despite the lack, there is a lack of legal and political framework in most of these developing countries, e.g. Venezuela and Sri Lanka, as they state, because of government upturn, whatever not. And that's why often it's very important for regulation to exist, but I'll talk about that later. But here I specifically want to talk about the correct allocation of money and the ROI, right? I feel like they paint these leaders as like bumbling idiots that don't know how to do anything. I think that's not just a mean characterization, but I think it's also factually untrue. Because think even in the mind of a dictator or a general who just did a military coup or a new president that's in charge of taking care of a post-revolutionary state, they want to benefit their country. Why? Because when the people are economically fulfilled, when they have the capability to work and get money and feed their family, that's when they're happy with the regime and that's when you have power. And if you are a benevolent dictator or a benevolent leader, for example, your dreams of setting up a good and robust democratic system relies on you being able to uplift your people economically so they can have access to education and uplift themselves politically, for example. What does this all mean for you? That means that pragmatically speaking, even if it's not the president, their finance minister, their economics minister, their cabinet, for example, will want some form of economic upliftment for these countries. So they're still likely to invest in SOEs and SMEs, and they're still likely to do it well. They're probably going to analyze, if I have a lot of nickel under our side, we're going to focus on nickel. We're going to ramp up nickel production. If we have oil, we're going to focus on that. That's what Saudi Arabia did, for example. Or we have other natural resources or other forms of economic upliftment, such as service industry, for example. We're going to focus on that under our side of the house because it's pragmatically important and beneficial for us as a leader of this country in a post-revolutionary state. But the problem on the negative side of the house is that you don't even give them the chance to be able to do this in the first place. Because if they want to trade their nickel and if they need the money to be able to subsidize their industries, when they go into the WTO and IMF, they have to subject themselves to all of these FDIs from Apple, from Samsung, from all of these Western industries, which means that these SOEs and SMEs don't even get the chance to be subsidized. The government doesn't even get a chance to regulate this investment in the first place because it doesn't have that legal framework. And what you get Western powers putting all of their influence into these developing states. So insofar that WTO and IMF still is a prerequisite for countries to be able to participate in the global economy, we say it's wrong that it forces these developing countries to not even have a chance to be able to develop their own economies in turn. At least a comparative under our side of the house is they're able to invest in their SOEs and SMEs in the short term and be able to join the WTO to be able to trade with other countries or join the IMF to be able to take loans even without that economic reform. And so the framing side is, right, we're not saying it's guaranteed that these developing countries will be successful in the long term. In fact, I think when Negative says that there's poor fiscal policy, and they're trying to mitigate that by saying that there's an incentive to have an ROI, I'm not quite sure that is the case because rational leaders exist under our side. And if leaders are irrational and don't know what they're doing, they're going to fail just as much under their side. But it's definitely bad under our side is that developing countries are taking the chance to exploit these countries in the very, very first place and locking them out of the chance for them to bring themselves up economically. But what's a long-term harm, right? We say, one, there's a hijacking of domestic economy foreign actors. Often these are much bigger companies, as Sharon explained to you, such as Apple, and that's why they outcompete SOEs and SMEs within their own country, for example. But secondly, when you don't cooperate with Western powers, that's when you get double punishment. That's when you get sanctions. That's when you get locked out of the global trade, even when at first you chose to cooperate because you needed to take those loans or you needed to trade with other countries. At least under our side of the house, where this is not the dominant doctrine, for example, then European or America, for example, can internalize the fact that they're not the kings of the jungle and that there are other valid economic frameworks that they can work with, and they no longer have that principal justification under our side of the house. And if anything, they'll get condemnation from other international actors, for example, the moment that they want to sanction Indonesia or the moment that they want to plant Apple as a monopoly in Indonesia, for example. And here I also want to talk about debt. And even to the extent that they take debt to build their industries, as explained by negative side of the house, I will note that to the point where the domestic industries are largely dominated by these foreign industries that largely funnel the profit and the money back to their homeland. Apple, for example, doesn't even give much of their profit towards the countries that the people of Indonesia, or in other developing countries such as Africa, for example, where France is exploiting Western Africa. They don't have the state money to pay off those debts because that's not your money, that's Apple's money. And in no way Apple is going to help you pay off those debts. If anything, it's within their interest to keep you in debt because it means you're constantly in debt to them. You constantly have to rely on them for these trades. You have to ask for more loans so you can benefit your own state enterprises so you can finally pay off the debts, but it's never going to happen because they're always going to be outcompeted by this foreign investment that negative ascribes as being so proliferating under their side of the house. But what can countries do under our side? One, they can collect more taxes and put that into welfare for its citizens as a direct benefit, and we explain why there's incentive for them to do that. Secondly, they can subsidize industries, maybe not to the extent that China did with its EV production, for example, but we could argue that for many different industries, they can do that. And that's helpful for these SOEs and SMEs that are recovering from whatever calamity they faced in the past. Third, they can on developing their own SOEs to provide not just utilities for their people, but also probably cheaper products and more prosperity for their people. And then if those SOEs become robust enough, they can think of privatizing them, for example, when they have the money and the legal framework to do that. But fourthly, they can heavily regulate foreign investment. I think this rebuts that idea. Sure, I think Apple would still want to invest in Indonesia simply because we have such a big market. But the difference is, insofar that the government actually has the political power to be able to regulate this well, to say that if you want to invest in us, you have to contribute some amount back to our people, then we think investment happens, even to a lesser extent, but it happens better and it benefits these developing countries more within the long run. So in the long run, if it happens to be that their economy matures enough that they can survive economic liberalism, and they think that's the best choice for them, then we allow them to do it. But the difference on our side is we don't force them to take that path immediately because we know they probably can't handle it and another economic framework fits them better. I think I've rebutted everything from Vinay. If anything else comes out from DLO, I think Jared can take a good crack at that, and that's why you affirm.
Thank you for that remark. Now can I have second negative?
Hello, am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. Everything I wanted to say was already said by Sharon. So, same remarks. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. A couple of engagements first before I get into my extension, right? They say a lot of things about like wanting to just leave it up to the country and a lot of method up as to why that's important, right? But let's engage into it one by one. The first speaker of negative of affirmative said that they want subsidies for SMEs. Affirmative wants to leave it up to the country to do economic policies that they want, not without even being indoctrinated into anything, right? I love how affirmative wants a more equal bargaining power for developing country, but also fails to realize that the prerequisite for that is if the country's economy itself is good and stable. I think this also only benefits Western countries anyways, which is the thing they want to oppose, right? That is in proximity with countries that are developed in the very first place, that wants to make bilateral agreements that can benefit both parties, etc. But you cannot say the same thing for developing countries that is far from the Western Hemisphere, like Southeast Asian countries. You risk them doing, one, bilateral agreements that does little to no benefit for them just to get their economy flowing, but two, stagnant development, but also stagnant bargaining power in status quo, right? Like what Vinay has said, Indonesia is able to say no and do certain things now is because we were first empowered via the trade from like the from the get-go, right? I cannot imagine how APBN can suddenly help our local SMEs if our economy is literally facing a collapse or isn't as good as it is right now. So every single benefit coming from like the first speaker of affirmative saying that they want to empower SMEs, we don't want to rely on like international companies building their stuff here, or like international like products, etc., can only run under the prerequisite of the developing countries being stable enough to actually do those policies in the very first place, able to sustain their economy in the very first place first, like Indonesia as it is right now, because you cannot say the same for Indonesia, let's say like 30 years ago or like 40 years ago, right? But secondly, they say that international financial institutions is Western leaning, so even if protectionist efforts exist, it has to be Western benefiting, right? I think to some extent, why we have these international financial institutions is because they do want to help out development in these developing countries, and that's exactly how how status quo goes and how this debate can run, right? That's why some of collateral that happens within the agreements itself is like it comes in the form of like ensured development from the developing countries that need the money from these institutions in the very first place. But let's say that protectionist efforts in the worst case scenario is still shifted into Western interest. Again, I think it's a worst case scenario because if you, as a developing country, now with bargaining power, then you can trade with other countries that is not a part of the Western hemisphere. Like let's say China, for example. So market segmentation for your country still exists if you for some reason are blacklisted by the West and you don't want to opt into the West anymore, but you are still open to trade with other countries that exist, right? But even if it still accommodates to the West, like even in the worst case scenario it happens, I think this is still better because you have institutions that at least are overlooking you and act as a safety net for you instead of you doing the same fall and do a bilateral agreement that does you any no good without that safety net in the very first place. And I think we've already proven why countries are more at risk with bilateral agreements, because not only don't you have any parties overlooking you, but also it's very easy to just skew up bilateral agreements, more importantly, instead of you conforming to like a certain institutions like agreements, etc., to open up your trade and at least have the safety net from them, right? But lastly, they call out the fact that we mischaracterize world leaders. I think it's not a mischaracterization when it's literally what's happening in status quo. The countries that don't opt into free trade, we hear little to nothing about them because they're very closed off, right? So it begs the question, are they even developing in the very first place? But also the ones that we do know of is only in such a little amount, and because they're maybe prominent in the way they run their politics, or maybe they're very doubled down in the way they deny the Western hemisphere or stuff like that, right? The country that don't opt into free trade, unfortunately, we hear little to nothing about because there's nothing to talk about with them. They're really closed off. They're not opened up. But that does two things. One, it closes you off from any alliances that can benefit you in case of anything that happens in the world. But secondly, it means that your economy, once it falls, is going to be very, very hard for you to get back up. But if anything, it's just going to doom your economy even further when you don't decide to open up, right? So I'm going to like explain to you why, for the people, especially in your country or on the ground, how it's going to help when you opt into free trade, right? I think we need to understand first why countries that are protectionist don't want to opt into free trade. It's probably because of a couple of things. Like, firstly, it's the same concept as to why conservatives are still conservatives, as in they want to preserve their natural resources, they want to keep local cultures, etc. That is a bit getting traded off when you open up your country to trade internationally, letting other countries building infrastructures on your land, etc. But secondly, they have the thought that aligning with, let's say, the West is gonna do them more harm than good for maybe ideologies or like other reasons, right? Like the thing that has been brought up by affirmative. But note that, panels, the counterfactual, when you don't open up your country to trade, then the development for your people, when the counterfactual that becomes when you don't open up your country to trade is the development for your people is going to be stagnant or like not even developing. The threats of inflation are bigger, etc., etc. It's going to be way worse. Let's think about it like this: when you get the incentive of opening up your country because you need the money from these international institutions, then you're going to be more likely to do that exact same thing, right? To just opt into the doctrine. That in comparison, where you just don't have anything incentivizing you and it's left to your own like free will as a country, then you're most likely not going to opt into it, right? Because you're so headstrong in what you believe in. But I think in doctrine is like a word that is framed very negatively, even if it has negative connotations. Let's think about it like this: it's more of a guidance for people that doesn't really know what to do, or is in a position where they do not know what to do. I think it's completely fair for these international like institutions to help out countries but want something in return, right? It's not like we're just leaving these countries behind in the end of the day anyways. We're still offering them what they want, but they have to agree to be able to open up to like free trade that also inevitably benefits them in the first place. Benefit them how? Firstly, when you open up your country to free trade, most likely other countries wants to build infrastructure with you or wants to do bilateral agreements with you because now they know that, oh, you are a country that can be negotiated with. You're a country that can be like that can make agreements with, etc., because you're not so closed off anymore, right? That's exactly how we get most of the infrastructure that we have currently in Indonesia. Let's say comparatively, if we are constantly closed off, I don't think we'll have the development that we have currently right now. So it does two things. Firstly, it at least ensures that infrastructure in our country is going to be built way quicker than comparatively when we don't open up our country. But secondly, it also ensures that the business or economy flowing for our locals is going to be more insured in the very first place because of two reasons. Firstly, now your country has actually the bargaining power to trade with other people your local goods, introducing your local produces to the outside world or like other countries that wants to opt into you at the very first place. And we can see this happening because a lot of our local products are actually getting like very good traction outside. Very simple like example, Indomie or Kopiko, right? Something that I think would never happen if we just completely close off like our option to freely trade with other people. But secondly, it also brings our local people the goods that we necessarily would not have from the outside. This also doesn't like only go for infrastructure, let's say like MRT and stuff like that, but it also comes in the form of like just foreign goods in general, like food or like services, etc., right? So with that in mind, I've already engaged to you how then the local economy won't exactly be better with you not opting into the free trade, but I've also proven to you how even in like a big scale with the building of infrastructure, it benefits our local people, but on like a more smaller scale, the economy flowing for our local people is also going to be better on our side. With all of these reasons, I do not understand why we shouldn't have this as a main doctrine because I think it's completely fair when it brings more benefits to all of the parties involved. That's all for my speech. Proud to negate.
Thank you for that remark. Now, can I have third affirmative?
Hi. Just give me a second. I have to go to the bathroom first. 1 minute. Right. I'm audible, yeah. Okay. So
Yes.
thank you. Yeah, I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. The first thing that I'm going to do is to negate Pinay's idea, talking about how international financial institution only works when you only ask for assistance. For example, like when you ask IMF or World Bank for loans. This is not the case due to 3 different stories that have existed worldwide. 1, Argentina emergency law in 2001. I think prior to 2001, Argentina was issuing a lot of government bonds to be bought by a lot of private companies in order to make their market more liberal and part of their free trade, as encouraged by IMF before, which is to increase their leverage of bank. Leverage is the gap between debt and positive asset. So basically, they keep issuing bonds without having the access to repay the bond as a part of free trade and economic liberalism. What happened was that Argentina government failed to pay every single bond, and it went to a very bad crisis. Venezuela, that Vinay claimed, had the same thing. This means that IMF was there promoting to increase the leverage, not only when they are asked for assistance, but they keep constantly on making sure that Argentina opened their market. This is the first story, and it has already negated Pinay's logic. Secondly, U.S. housing crisis in 2008. Since early 2004, the economic liberalism and the deregulation of the market has caused the circulation of toxic derivatives within the market, not only in US, but the whole world, right? World Bank that foresaw a lot of central banks in the whole world. They knew what was coming with the circulation of toxic derivatives. They did nothing. They are causing another crisis, worldwide crisis. Once again, Phoenix logic of only when asked for assistance cannot apply. Lastly, context of Sri Lanka bankruptcy. Since 2010-ish, Sri Lanka has all out of foreign investment pushes by World Bank. After the crisis, IMF gave fund to Sri Lanka in order for them to privatize more. Therefore, it privatized more commercial banks within Sri Lanka. However, as we've seen, Sri Lanka now is not growing. Many commercial banks have promised to fund the port city project in Colombo, but it all failed. Why? Because simply more banks are now opting out because they don't see Sri Lanka as a good investment anymore, causing the government of Sri Lanka's economy once again fail. What is the importance of all of these three contexts of stories worldwide? Every economic liberalism actual manifestation failed. And the one behind that is the international financial institution. So therefore, they're not the one that, used this doctrine in order for them to, use this doctrine when they're only asked for assistance, but they are the one that is actively causing it as well, causing all of this crisis due to this liberalism doctrine. Once again, everything that negative said, false matter. Secondly, I'm going to engage on, is economic liberalism actually beneficial? Well, I will argue that maybe, it's a very different thing for every country, right? For example, like Indonesia, we love foreign direct investment, but we don't like trading natural resources. Or like in Brazil, they love trading coffee, but maybe they don't like FDI. So what does this imply is that to what extent are you going to open your market? Because when you force countries to open up every single thing in their market, in their domestic market, it will harm their economy because countries have different interests. Countries have different goals. Indonesia loves FDI, Brazil doesn't. So you cannot force every single country to open up. But one thing for sure, that is guaranteed to be beneficial for developed countries. Why? Because one, they get interest because Sharon has already told you they're the one that keeps on actively lending and giving the money supply to World Bank that was going to be given to other developing countries, so they get interest. Secondly, they want to control foreign market through privatization and deregulation of the market. Therefore, they're guaranteed to get benefit. While developing countries, when they're forced to open up, it will be very bad. I'm going to talk about two things. One, principle of government intervention, and secondly, why financial institutions worsen the economy. One, principle of government intervention. So when First AF told us that we want ourselves to open to international market, especially when we ask for assistance. This is exactly why we are used. As developing countries, we are forced to submit to financial institution, right? When we don't have money, we don't really have nothing to say. So when we ask for loans, you have to submit to all of their policies by opening up your market, which sometimes even harm your sovereignty and your choice as a country. But secondly, this is also very bad because you're exposing yourself. This is why Carlson's hijacking argument became very important, because now you're very exposed to sanction and you're forced to sell a product that you don't even want to sell. Like Indonesia are forced to sell their nickels. So this is very bad. When you open yourself to international market through international financial institutions, you're forced to open up every single thing. You are very, very exposed to every attack coming from developed countries, as once again, we've characterized that they are the one controlling the market. And then First Up also told us that access is very important. And we see that this is very inexclusive because in our side of the house, we can open up if it is beneficial for us. There's to say, even if we don't really get really big in terms of free trade, but we have trade groups. So therefore, insofar our needs are fulfilled, using bilateral agreements that second negative wants to champion, we can also have that. So I don't really think why access is something that's very exclusive in their side of the house. But what is exclusive in our side of the house is the choice. Because countries that are ready to open up can do it. Indonesia wants to open up only to FDI, but does not want to open up to free trade of natural resources, for example. We can do it. In their side of the house, they can't. This is why the benefit on our side is exclusive. And then First Up said that, you know what, IMF and World Bank want their money back. We want to make sure that, the money is put on the right table. Yes, this is very much I don't really know how they mechanize this, how open up free market or free trade will guarantee their money back. But insofar that I know, as I've already characterized, this is only to fulfill the developed countries' interest to control the foreign market, because this is where they can finally put their foreign direct investment, because they think that this is, oh, you know what, I can just be predatory in this country because they need me. Those kind of things. Once again, beneficial for developed countries, bad for developing countries. In our side of the house, you can have a choice in order for you to want to open up to certain specific things of free trade in the world. Secondly, why do financial institutions worsen the economy with liberalism policy? I think it's pretty clear. When second negative told us that, you know what, it's way worse for people's interest because now we can't have economic running. It's very much false, right? Because for example, let's take a case study of Apple investment in Indonesia. They don't want to pay tax. If we allow them to enter in Indonesia, it will create a very, very worse thing, right? Because one, you are going to have competitions retaliating towards government. Samsung, Oppo, Vivo, they're all paying for taxes. They stay in Indonesia. However, we now take Apple exclusively and say that, hey, you don't have to pay tax. Of course, there will be retaliation. It's going to be worsen for the competition domestic market. But secondly, they don't pay taxes. How can you get benefit for the people's interest? I don't really understand how it can happen. But lastly, Apple's investment in Indonesia will not likely going to increase the numbers of employees, because they're most likely going to import all those employees from United States as well. Because insofar we know that they don't really have good intention to our people, they just want to control our market. So what does this prove to you? Is that the privatization and deregulation of the market is bad for national interest, especially for developing countries, because we don't have contingency plans. US survived 2008 housing crisis because they have lots of federal reserve to fund if those banks fail. Developing countries don't have that funds to back up if we fail. What is the importance of this whole context? Developing countries are very cooked with this policy, and without the main doctrine, we do have the choice in order to maintain our national interest.
Okay, thanks for the speech. Now we're gonna have third negative.
Hello, I'm audible.
Yes.
Okay, wait. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think one thing that is clear is that from affirmative, they're trying to recontextualize this debate, but not whether trying to engage to our explanation on how this will actually happen. So we don't think that contextualization has actually diminished our explanation or analysis on how this will actually happen, right? So okay, maybe you can buy the contextualization, but that doesn't mean that the analysis are true, right? But secondly, they also said that they are not half stands, but throughout the end of their speaker, they say that, oh yeah, they can open up if they want to with the option. And this is clearly a very half stance thing, right? Because in first, they are trying to impose government intervention, but in the end of the day, they are going for the option is to want to open up in the end of the day, right? We think that this is a very we can also say that this country can also close up their borders. They can also go to government interventionists when they already got their funds in the end of the day, right? So we don't on their side, but it's also we can also do it in the end of the day, right? But what does it mean then? It means that on their side that the government interventionist will also literally translates into economic liberalism in the end of the day, right? So we don't understand why it has to be done via government intervention in the first place when it will translate into economic liberal in the end of the day. But then they also say that they don't have contingency plans if they fail. We think that it's very important to understand here is that the countries that need this institution help in the first place are very desperate. They need this money to actually incentivize their economy in the first place, right? So they don't have any way to actually do this rather than doing this via the institution. So that's why this contextualization is very true, and that's why I already won this debate. But then let's go on to my two clashes, right? So firstly, on which is the best economic doctrine, and secondly, the impact to the countries itself, right? So on to my first clash there, on which is the best economic doctrine. I think when affirmative comes to the debate by saying that, oh, yeah, these institutions are very Western centric, right? This doctrine is very Western centric. They will get harmed, they will get exposed, they will get double punishment even if they don't follow. And if five responses to this, right? Firstly, I think this is a very specific examples on Apple and Indonesia, right? So not a general characterization on whether this will actually happen. So why don't they talk about Sri Lanka, who literally need this institution money in the first place, when they literally are doing this because they need those kind of money, right? But then secondly, we don't think that the Western countries then are likely to do this kind of things, right? Because they need this developing country to do their trade in the first place and resources in the end of the day, right? So it's very unlikely for them to actually impose this kind of sorry, not tariff, impose this kind of sanctions, for example, to these developing countries because they still need the resources, they still need the workforce, for example. This is industry, for example, for this Western country to actually be able to develop themselves more. And thirdly, then, I think a worse punishment for these developing countries will, of course, create more tension with Asian countries, right? Where they going to be Western versus Asian countries, which isn't what the Western countries want at the end of the day, right? Because there is already enough tension in status quo, whether it's economically or politically in the end of the day, right? So this tension is very likely to happen because when Western countries won't try control or expose, we think that if the president is that smart, for example, if the are that smart, then they will understand that it's an effort of trying to westernize this country in the first place, right? So we don't understand then why it's very likely for this country to be westernized. But we think that this actually be more harm on their side, right? For response, as when they try to regulate the international companies or free trade, because they are now and impose more tariff on these products. And this means that A, you now get embargo or even get a stopped trade from these countries because you literally disincentivize them to trade with your countries, right? So this will less trades with other countries without a guarantee on your products actually getting better, right? Because there are no comparison on that. But then B, not only you get this harm for Western countries, but you also get it from your quote-unquote allied countries, right? For example, Indonesia with China, because now you will have to regulate all international products. We'll have to impose that kind of tariff, that kind of tax, for example, to all international products in the end of the day, right? But even if then, on the last response, they got harm or control, we think that A, the benefit we offer with the free trade, explained by Vinay, this will help them get more accessibility, and how this will trickle down for the citizens, actually is more in the interest of the government rather than being westernized, right? I think they will be more willing to westernize if they get this benefit to their citizens anyway, because citizens are the obligation of the country in the end of the day, right? So that's why this country are very likely to do this in the end of the day. But then B, we think this is even more incentive for SME and SOEs to compete with the in the first place, right? Because they can see that this market are very saturated on these Western products. Then what does that mean? It means that this SME and SOE, if they want to, for example, make a livelihood to push for their products, then they have to make better products. They have to make better quality. It means that the quality on our side will also be better, right? Even if it doesn't happen. So that's why I have already proven to you why economic liberalism is literally the best economic doctrine, because first, even affirmative conform to us, and then secondly, no other alternative. So that's why we won on the first clash. But on the second clash, then the countries, I think when they say that this liberalism, because it's only good for developed countries because they don't have a good quality, they don't have a good quality product. But that's just completely untrue in the first place, right? I think market segmentation exists in status quo. So competition can still happen, even if it is a low barrier. So the markets always exist, and there will always be a buyer for the products, right? But then they can compete. The products are supported by other countries. We think that tariffs and tax still exist on our side. So it isn't as if our countries are letting these companies really on our side. They still get tax, they still get tariff, but it's just a low percentage, and that low percent is already enough. Because with free trade, the amount of tax that you get will be much more from when more companies come into your country and that opt into the free trade in the end of the day, right? So we think that the trade-off is already enough, and the trade-off is beneficial enough for us in the end of the day. But then the country also need this institution then help in the first place, as so they cannot subsidize this companies in the end of the day. But then second response then, we don't think that subsidization also translate into industry proliferation because this industry in the end of the day still need to understand how to actually do their budgeting as how to create a more quality of products in the end of the day, right? So we don't think that without this do it, and without the comparison, they don't have explained it yet, right? But then last, if does even if subsidization or government intervention, we think it's much worse on their side, right? A much worse alternative on affirmative because it will create a dependency then on these companies in the end of the day, as they will government incentive, they will need constantly need government subsidization. Thus, this company in the end of the day cannot grow on their own when they get the subsidization, right? So that's why proud to negate.
Thank you for that speech. That concludes the substantive part of the debate. Now welcome the next reply to conclude the case for Nick.
Cool. Yeah, just double checking if I'm audible and
Yeah.
visible.
Yeah,
Awesome. Thank you. Oops, wait, there you go. Yeah, great debate so far. Amazing speeches, especially from affirmative. Really, really glad to be in this room. Hopefully the reply also does this debate justice. Starting in 3, 2, 1. The biggest unengaged piece of material on negative side is our context of when these countries need help from international institutions. What we prove to you is 2 things. 1, there is a degree of vulnerability, and 2, a likelihood of them being exploited or straight up losing out to competition when the doctrine does not actually exist within these international institutions. I think, okay, affirmative may know more about the economy than we do. Like, I'm still someone that thinks that you should just print more money because I don't get what inflation means. But we give to you a very simple and intuitive piece of framing on why you actually just need to empower these countries in the very first place. I think what affirmative does not realize is that, and this I think eventually becomes the tipping point of the debate, is that not every country immediately needs IMF loans, and not every country immediately responds to demands from WTO. I think it is always specific scenarios when they've made so many mistakes that they need trillions of dollars as a loan to stabilize their economy to prevent it from actually collapsing. This is not a gross mischaracterization of leaders, as Carlson very convincingly says. This is in fact the most vulnerable actor that affirmative are not actually able to benefit. What about choice? Because affirmative frames that as their biggest delta. I think the most important piece of framing that you need to understand is that choice is only a benefit if you make the correct choice in the first place. The likelihood that affirmatives give only proves that some countries need to make protectionist policies if that is what suits their economy. I think that we don't close the entirety of that door to them insofar as they acknowledge that A, this goes against the advice of financial institutions, which means that they will not get the help from IMF, WTO, etc., unless B, they are eventually ready to open up their market, right? This is where I think Jared specifically shoots affirmative's case in the foot. Because if the counterfactual of affirmative is that these institutions will not opt into the doctrine, then the funding, the brokerage of trade agreements, etc., will not be conditional to free trade policies, which means that they have to give loans, even if the countries choose mass regulation to industries, even if the countries want to centralize the hell out of everything. That is the affirmative counterfactual that I've framed to you literally on my first negative speech that they've taken for granted in the first place, because affirmative does not eventually prove the comparative of benefit when that extent of harm happens, and only proves that yay, countries are going to have a choice. I think then if affirmative cannot prove it to that degree, then they also cannot win on likelihood of benefit. So that point goes to negative. Then okay, why does all of these things actually matter? because we tell you that the debate does not have a delta if it is just talking about whether or not countries should opt into free trade. Because you can make a case for both. You can take very convenient examples of Argentina on one side or Burkina Faso on the other side. But I think the debate's delta exists within these institutions. The stance they take and how that help that they give is actually going to influence emerging economies, but more importantly, the rational calculus. And I think this is why Lewis' responses matter so much, because we prove to you that what happens when this is the doctrine. I think affirmative case on choice does not actually cater to the role of these institutions themselves in influencing the country's rational calculus. So if affirmative's case is on choice, we also posit to you we don't understand why the choice they make is their choice in the first place. But B, if you still do not buy that, then me and Renee from first and second negative have also proven that countries that do not opt into these institutions will also lose out in terms of competition and stability. I think this is something that affirmative also dismiss. So what we do is prove to you that on the ground, in terms of a micro impact, or on a general scale of the economy in the macro scale, we win not only on the likelihood of benefit, but upon the vulnerability of these countries in actually making an informed decision. This is where we tell you that it is okay to tell these countries that you cannot get these benefits unless they opt into free trade, because you don't know the rationality of this economy. They don't know the rationality of these leaders. At the end of the day, continuously proud to negate.
Thank you for that remark. Closing the entire debate, calling affirmative reply.
Okay. I guess since this is a momentous occasion, I have to open my camera. Okay. Yeah, I'll start in 3, 2, and 1. I want to call out 3 things. 1, I think there's a lack of engagement with negative side of the house with regards to the points that have evolved. I think the original points of allocation of funds, debt taking the vulnerable countries are excellent points, but we've already rebutted those. We've provided engagement. We've said allocation can exist. We said that it's exactly because these countries are vulnerable, and that's why we want to keep them out of this economic liberalization. But to the extent that these countries require money, I think what they lack in this instance is explaining further why the help that these have economic liberalization as a prerequisite. But moreover, if the solution is pumping hundreds of millions of dollars into Venezuela, into Sri Lanka, and all of these countries, why does that lead to a more sustainable economy? We explained to you that structurally that only leads to Western hijacking, and that leads to all of the bad examples that you see that Vinay is too scared to rebut, and that's why he dismisses that in his reply. The second thing is on the doctrine. Diallo says guidance, but realize that for both affirmative and negative impacts to exist, the doctrine has to be rather strict, right? Because if negative wants to talk about the regulation of money flow, you want to talk about getting these economies out of the gutter, you're going to have to exert as much power as possible. We also explain why Strachey is likely to be implemented that way, because in that way you get the maximum benefit for these Western companies, where they get to choose what industries to focus on, what tax rates they get, and who they have tariffs with and who they don't. So the contextualization from Jared enters here, because it is true that the WTO and the IMF has the power to force these countries to do whatever they want. This is something they concede as well. But thirdly, on the stance, I don't think they get our stance in second and third, because our stance was to say that these institutions would simply not be involved in the process of choosing a framework under our side of the house, right? So you can still have whatever economic framework you want, but you can still be within the WTO and the IMF. I think Reply mounted a slight response to this when they said that, you're giving all these loans, but they have centralized economy. I don't get the harm. And if that comes out in Reply, I think that's very, very late. Even if that's a key point on their case, I need to explain why that is a prerequisite for all of their benefits. I mean, like Europe does it all the time. They have often centralized economies, but they still take loans. Okay, 2 clashes. Firstly, a small clash on the context for these developing countries, right? I think there was a big idea on the competency of these developing countries and whether it is required for us to pick them out of the gutter. I don't think negative necessarily explained to you why this is the vast majority of all instances. That is to say that these are countries that are so incredibly desperate that they're willing to give up all of their government sovereignty and political sovereignty and economic sovereignty just to get all of that money. We explained to you there's probably a spectrum of that, and the problem with that was that negatives forcing everybody to do the same thing. But if you have 2 beliefs on the competence competence in developing countries. I'm going to explain to you why they're still bad. If you believe that the leaders are competent, then the harm is that you don't even give them a chance to be able to implement their economic policies. Insofar that in order to even take out money or trade with other countries, they have to concede to the policies that WTO and IMF set. But secondly, if you believe that the leaders are not competent, they're extra screwed under their side of the house because they're not going to know how to regulate this FDI in the long run. They're going to let Apple have all of these tax rates. They're going to let Apple hire expats. They're not going to make sure that Apple has CSR, for example, exactly if the legal framework is that bad. So the weighings on exclusivity, even if their benefit is inexclusive, because we still accept that if you have competent leaders, for example, but their harms are definitely exclusive because it is inherently brought on by the existence of the policies these WTO set, regardless of the type of leader that you're talking about within these developing countries. The second clash here is on which side leads to better economic development. We said a slew of things. We said Western hijack government, you hire expats, there's regulatory capture, and you outcompete companies on all levels and all markets. So market segmentation doesn't make sense. You already preempted that. But secondly, comparatively, at least on the our side, economic development can be better when you have the freedom to subsidize the strategic industries that you have, for example, where you can choose who to trade with, when you want to protect your SMEs and SOEs, when you have to invest in welfare and all of these things. But moreover, I think we also extended saying that this is to a better robustness of the economy if there's any crisis that happens, for example. And what did they say in response? They said the closest thing was correct allocation of funds and getting of loans. We already rebutted this over and over again under our side of the house. But we flipped this, right? Because the correct investment strategies only exist under our side of the house, insofar that these have a mature enough economy they can decide on their own what investments to accept and what to not. And the weighings on vulnerability, we at least focus on these developing countries, make sure that they have a sustainable economy in the long run, even a chance at doing that, rather than focusing on having a savior complex for these developed countries and thinking that they always have the solution to everything, which they do not. That's why you affirm.